Okay, and welcome to one of the final lectures in the graphics and animation class. And today what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to finish up what we were talking about, basic bullet dynamics. And so once we're through with this, you'll understand at least most of the features that we talked about last time. Okay, so here we are. We're going to talk about bullet dynamics 2, and today we're going to discuss destruction and forces. And so that's actually a rather important little thing to add here. Now, to review what we talked about last time, there are different types of objects that you're going to encounter in bullet dynamics. The first is a static body. Once again, a static body never moves. Literally, you can smack it all you want, it's not going to go anywhere. A rigid body will move, but it will move based on forces. So if you got a rigid body up here, the moment gravity acts on it, it's going to start to fall. And so rigid bodies hit other rigid bodies. They're rigid. Now, a parts body can explode, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. It's kind of fun. A parts body is designed to shatter. Deforming bodies, we showed you that last time. They kind of wiggle and wobble. They can deform. And kinematic bodies are bodies that you can move. And so you move a kinematic body and it behaves like a rigid body. It can hit another rigid body, or it can hit a static body. And so that's what a kinematic body does. And so parts bodies, we're going to talk about that right now, and breakage. So basically this is a two-step process. You've got a parts body. The first thing you want to do is take the object that you want to become the parts body and go into Modeler with it and break it. I'm going to show you how you can do that. And the one thing about this that's really interesting, this is where we begin to use these programs to create objects out of thin air, meaning that the modeler program will literally create the fragments that will appear in the parts body. And the model program will actually create these fragments. Sometimes this works out better than others in layout. I'm not going to lie to you. Occasionally we have issues with this, but generally speaking, this works very well. And then, bang! You get to create things and destroy them. Isn't that fun? Now, the types of forces that can act on these objects, we're going to go over these in a little bit of detail today. Gravity is one. That's the one that you can always depend on. It's always there somewhere. A force field, which can become just about anything. Collisions, where an object hits another object, and that we've already really talked about. Wind is where you literally create the effect of blowing things. And so we're not going to get into a whole lot of detail there, but just to get you started. And constraints is a new one. This is something that is just sort of coming into my area of expertise, and it has some potential. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit. But at this point, I think this is as far as we really can get this semester. Okay, so here we are back where we were last time with our little dynamics demonstration. And so we're not really going to do much more with this. We're just basically going to kind of extend on what we've done before. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go into Polygon Mode. And I'm just going to move some things around because I want to make sure we have some space here. So modify, move, and I'm just going to move that over there a little bit. And so basically we got those two objects and we got the table, and that's really all we're going to use. So then I'm just going to save this object as it is and look over here in layout. And so if I load the object, which is dynamics, then you see there it is. And we're going to go in on it, and you see if we're in on it, we've got those objects there. And so what we've got is a big object and a little object. And we can move these around here too. And so I'm just going to move the light over there, and I'm going to keep this real simple. I'm just going to destroy this ball. That's all I'm going to do with it. But the one thing I will do is I'll give it a little bit more substance before I do. So if I go into Surface Editor, I can just turn on smoothing, and that'll be a smooth ball. So that's really all we have to do there. Now, I'm going to go back into Modeler, though, and I'm going to call up the ball in Modeler. This is where it gets interesting. So I'm going to go in on this so we can see it in better detail. And what we're going to do is we're going to program this thing to be destroyed. So if I go to my Polygon Mode, I'm just going... I'm just going to turn off move. So I'm going to select this object. Then I'm going to go to multiply. Anytime you turn one object into many, you're multiplying it. So in multiply, all the way down the bottom, you see this thing called destroy and this thing called fracture. So I'm going to hit fracture, and that gives me this dialog box here. And so I'm going to keep the defaults. So what we're going to have is a situation where we have an interior surface and an exterior surface. And we're just going to leave it in its original state here. And we're going to turn this ball into 100 pieces. You could make it as many pieces as you want, but that may be a little crazy. I'm just going to hit OK and see what happens. Wow, look at that. So now the ball looks like the surface of the moon. It's got all these fractures in it. Now, one thing you will notice is we have an additional layer now. So, and this is where it gets a little interesting. There's the original ball, and the layer next to it, we have, oops. And the layer next to it, we have the fractured ball. And so they look about the same. So I'm going to get rid of the original. Just going to get rid of it. And then I'm going to go to layout, and we can see there is my fractured ball. And so now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my FX properties, and I'm going to make that a parts body. So parts body. And so when I do that, it's going to want to fall because a parts body is also a rigid body. And let's see what happens. Okay, well, maybe it went below our... Actually, we haven't programmed it yet. That was the first thing we programmed. Let's underscore that. So as a rigid body, if I begin to move the timeline, you will see that it falls. Now, I want to make sure of something. I want to make sure that we're at least looking at the table. All right, so yeah, it's falling right through the table, but the table hasn't been defined yet. So I'm going to go to the table, and I'm going to define that. I'm going to define the table under FX Tools as a static body. Now, when I do that, now let's see what happens. See, the moment I get to a certain place, it wants to stop. Because it had to think about it. Look at that. All right, so I'm going to scoot this timeline over a little bit. I'm just going to give it some space because it's got to do the calculations. And right now my taskbar is on another screen, so you can't see it, but it is thinking about the calculations necessary to do this. So there you see it's simulating the appropriate dynamics. And so now the reason why it takes a little bit of time is because these objects basically are going to want to move in all kind of different directions. And so as a result, now instead of figuring out what happens to one ball, it's got to figure out what happens to 100 fragments. So I'm going to warn you that this can start to take up some time, but we'll see what we can do with it. Bloom. Okay, so if I go here, once it's calculated, and that is the shattering. So nice destruction. I'm going to add an object under items. I'm going to add a null object. A null object is an object that doesn't really exist. And I'm not going to name it anything. I'm just going to leave it as it is. I'm just going to say, okay. So there is my null object. And you can see it is very small. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to set it around the table. And that object is going to represent a force. So if I go to my FX Tools, and I go to my object properties, and I go to my item properties, you will see that there is the parts body and the static body, but the null object doesn't have any properties yet. So I am just going to go ahead and call that a force field. So under forces, I'm going to choose an explosion. So once I've done that, the null object now has a job. The null object is an explosion. And so I'm going to give that explosion some strength. Now explosions cause things to want to flee. Notice how the ball now wants to move to the side a little bit. So I'll take it all the way to the end there. And let's see what that did. Notice how the parts are flying away from it. And so I could also underscore this. If I were to make that a rigid body as well. Now they're both flying in different directions, and of course it will take a little while to figure itself out there. I'm going to change the nature of the force. And so if I go back to my null object, and I go to my item properties, my explosion is powerful. I'm going to make that a negative number instead. Now what will happen is it will try to draw things to it. So let's see what that worked. So notice now it's falling towards the force field and everything is now kind of settling in the middle there. And so is that what we want to do? Maybe. Now I'm going to try one more thing. So I'm going to go back to my item here. Instead of an explosion, I'm going to do this as a vortex. And I'm going to give it a positive number so that it's blowing away. Let's see what that would do. Okay, so for this, I'm going to close this window so you can see the whole thing. Now you can notice, unfortunately, and I'll sort of underscore this if I put it in VPR, well, VPR is looking better. Now watch the sphere as we move it along. Notice it's orbiting, but it's falling apart. Okay, so the explosion literally blew it apart. If the explosion was not quite as strong, it might not have done so. Either that, yeah, the explosion just blew it away. All right, so we've got the potential for all kinds of crazy things to happen. And this, you're just going to have to play with. I'm just going to be honest with you, because there is just so much that you can do that we can only basically begin to get into it. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it today. We're going to talk about maybe constraints later on, but this is basically about as far as we're going to get into bullet dynamics. And the only remaining topic we're going to do is particle dynamics, just so you can understand what that is, and you can decide how much you want to research that in the future.